projects we have built in Israel.
Together with JNF Canada, we're able to conserve the historical heritage of Bet Eshel.
Together with JNF Canada, we build a village for autistic people to live safely and independently.
Together with JNF Canada, we have created a physical activity program to help children with chronic diseases and disabilities.
Together with JNF Canada, we're expanding our facilities to enhance the vital work being done here at the Jaffa Dalet After School Center.
Together with JNF Canada, we are building an international pediatric cardiac center and children's hospital for children from Israel and from all around the world.
Together with JNF Canada, we're going to build a new activity center that will help the needs of teens, children, and young adults of the Negev.
Together with JNF Canada, we're addressing the urgent need for mental health care in our psychiatric clinic and psychotrauma center.
Together with JNF Canada, we are restoring and rehabilitating Ben Shemen's forest.
Together with JNF Canada, we're enhancing the lives of the community.
Together with JNF Canada, we've built a safe haven for girls with severe disabilities and complex medical conditions.
Together with JNF Canada, we're building a beautiful foster home for the children in Israel. This is the place, beautiful, look.
As you can see, JNF Canada has its fingerprint on the land of Israel, but also on the society. Saying that, I'd like to recognize JNF Canada's National President, Beth Price, and CEO, Lance Davis, both of which are with us today. I'd also like to welcome the Deputy Consul General, Shani Azulai, from the Israeli Consulate in Toronto, who is also here with us today. Also present is the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver, Ezra Shankin. Today's chat will be moderated by Vancouver's own Cynthia Ramsey. Cynthia is the editor of the Jewish Independent newspaper, formerly known as the Jewish Western Bulletin. The Jewish Independent has been providing news and information and opinions to Vancouver's Jewish community since 1930, and it is an award-winning newspaper and one of the oldest Jewish organizations in Vancouver. Cynthia, thank you for being with us today. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Bernice, and thank you very much to JNF Canada Pacific Region for inviting me to do this. I'm very excited and a little nervous, I will admit. It's an honor to be here to speak with Barak Ravid, and my honor to introduce him. He is, of course, the Middle East correspondent of Axios, which is based in Tel Aviv. He is also the diplomatic correspondent of Walla News in Israel. He started his journalistic career in 2005 as a diplomatic correspondent for the NRG website. He then moved to Haaretz newspaper, where he worked for a decade as a diplomatic correspondent and columnist. In 2017, he moved to television and worked as Channel 13's diplomatic correspondent until 2020. The past 17 years, Barak Ravid has covered Israel's national security and foreign policy, in addition to US policy in the Middle East. He has reported from more than 30 capitals and 5 continents and covered 3 Israeli prime ministers and 3 American presidents. Barak has published hundreds of exclusive stories on the Middle East peace process, Israel's relations with the Arab world, the Iran nuclear crisis, and the US-Israel relationship. Between 2019 and 2020, he published 2 series of in-depth stories on the secret relations between Israel and the Gulf states. Several months later, the Abraham Accords were signed. Barak Ravid is a frequent guest on American television networks, and of course, Zoom. He has given numerous interviews on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CBS, and Newsmax. He has wide-ranging reach on social media with more than 200,000 followers on Twitter, and his newsletter, Axios from Tel Aviv, is circulated every week to 30,000 subscribers. His recently published book, Trump's Peace, The Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East, which though only out in Hebrew at this moment, has generated a lot of discussion, to say the least, and I'm sure that it will come up here. I know that you will have a lot of questions from Barak's remarks. If you will put them in the chat, We will go through them and try to get to as many of them as possible. I will just warn you that we have had already a lot of questions submitted in advance. So if we don't get to yours, we apologize. But I know I'm excited, as I said, to hear what Barak has to say. So I'm going to turn the event over to him. Barak.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for this great introduction. And thank you all for being on this Zoom. I got to say that I'm very excited to do this with the great Jewish community in Canada, where I also have family members. So my heart is also in the Jewish community in Canada. I even think that one of my family members is here on this call, if I'm not mistaken, Marvin Shirkin, who I love very much. And I wanted to talk to you during this the next 10 or 15 minutes about my new book, Trump's Peace, the Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East. When I started writing this book, sometime in December 2020, at first I thought, do people even read books anymore? I wasn't sure. And I wasn't sure that even if they are still reading books, I'm not sure that, reading now 300 pages about, Trump and Bibi and the peace agreements in the Middle East, it's kind of a heavy issue, not like something that, you would want to get into over the weekend when you want some peace and quiet from from all the work you've done during the week. And at a certain point, I said, you know what, I don't care if people are interested or not, if they want to read it or not. I want to write this book because I really believe that the Abraham Accords are the biggest breakthrough in the Middle East peace process in the last 25 years. And as a diplomatic correspondent, this is, that's the reason you enter this job. When you're a military correspondent, you wait for a war because that's the height of your job. When you're a diplomatic correspondent, you wait for peace. And unfortunately, in the last 25 years, the military correspondents had much more work on their hands than the diplomatic correspondents. And finally, it happened. So for me, it was really not only that, on substance, I thought this is a huge development, but also for me, it was some kind of a, this point in your life and in your career when you say, okay, it happened. That's it. It happened in my lifetime. Now maybe it's time to take a break and write something more deep and more detailed about how it happened. And this was the mission I embarked on, to be the first person who writes the story, the most detailed account of the Abraham Accords and how it happened. And it took me something like 10 months, and the book was published last December in Israel in Hebrew. It's going quite good. I was surprised that there were several thousand people that decided that it was worth $25 and went and bought it and read it, and the reviews are also very good, so I'm very happy. And hopefully in early June there will be an English version that all of you will be able to read it too. Hopefully by then there will also be an Arabic version, so that people in the Arab world will be able to read it too. In many people ask me, why did you call the book Trump's Peace? As you know, Trump is quite a controversial person, and people don't really associate him. That's not like, peace is not the first association that first thing that comes to your mind when you say the word Trump. And I told a lot of people that I chose that name because it happens to be true. And one of the main conclusions of my book is that this historic development, this big breakthrough in Middle East peace, wouldn't have happened if another person sat in the Oval Office and not Donald Trump. And there are three reasons for this. First reason is because of Trump's policy in the Middle East. And again, some people like it, some people don't. Some people think it was great. Some people think it was disastrous. I'm not talking about opinions. At the end of the day, Trump's policies in the region sort of closed down the trust gap that was open between the US and the Israeli government and the US and Arab governments in the Arab world. This gap that was open during Obama's term in office, whether it was warranted or not, it doesn't matter. The gap was there. And Trump's policies in the region, mainly on Iran, closed down that gap and brought Israel and the Arab countries closer together. So that's the first reason. Second reason is because the people Trump put on this file. He appointed his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to deal with peace in the Middle East. Many people in America criticized it quite seriously. I can understand why this would seem, strange to Americans. But when I did interviews for the book with people in Israel and in the region, I was quite surprised that for people in the region, both in Israel and the Arab countries, it made a lot of sense that the son-in-law of the president is dealing with this file, because for them, it was a proof of how central this issue is for Trump. And it was a sort of a reassurance that when they speak to Jared Kushner, they speak to the president, and that there was no daylight between them. So at least in this region, it worked. And, if Jared Kushner failed and didn't get anything, we would all say, oh, you see, he appointed his son-in-law, no wonder it didn't work. But when it did, we have to give Trump the credit. So that's reason number two. Reason number three, and I think this is the most important one, is that Trump was ready to put his hand in his pocket and take out tangible deliverables and give them to countries in the region in order to encourage them to make the final leap towards establishing relations with Israel. For the United Arab Emirates, it was the arms sales, the sales of the F-35 fighter jets. For the Bahrain, it was an upgraded trade deal. For Sudan, it was removing them from the State Department terrorism list. And for Morocco, it was a US recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in the Western Sahara. So each got something. And without that, without those tangibles, those countries would not necessarily agree to take those steps. And I'm not sure that if somebody else sat at the White House at that time, he would be ready to give those tangible deliverables. And if not, then I'm not sure we would have had those agreements. So this is reason number three. And this is why I think that when I looked at this issue, the name Trump's peace was, I think, the most fitting. But it doesn't mean that Trump did it all by himself, not at all. There were two other leaders on this effort. One of them is the former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. When actually it's one of the things that I discovered while doing the research for the book is that for Netanyahu, the Abraham Accords weren't actually his first priority. His first priority, if you remember, in late June 2020, was his initiative to annex parts of the West Bank. and make them and apply Israeli law to them, something like 30% of the West Bank. And this was something Netanyahu was pushing for a year, and he set July 1st, 2020 as the deadline to begin the process of annexation. And this was his first priority. It was a campaign promise he made during election number 1, 2, and as you know, we had 3. Afterwards, we had 4. But you know, it was more than just a campaign promise that you do once every 4 years. It was a campaign promise that he did once every 4 months, and this was his first priority. But at the end of the day, he realized that the Trump administration wasn't interested in this at all, and that it was and that he was heading towards a clash, a potential clash with President Trump. So this wasn't his first priority, but Netanyahu deserves a lot of credit for all the work he did in the decade before that. When Netanyahu came back to office in 2009, during his first meeting with President Obama in May 2009, he told Obama, let's look at things differently. And he called this strategy outside in, meaning let's go first to the Arab world. Let's get the Arab countries involved in the peace process. And through that, we can maybe make it easier for the Palestinians to make concessions and make it easier for me as the Prime Minister of Israel, this is what Netanyahu said, to sell the deal to the Israeli public. Obama really liked this approach, but back at the time, the Arab countries weren't ready. It was premature. The Saudis rejected it out of hand, and then all the smaller Arab countries that were ready to consider taking normalization steps backed off. But Netanyahu didn't just drop this idea. He decided to pursue it quietly, slowly, gradually, and step by step. He built very robust secret relationship between Israel and many Arab countries in the region. And this infrastructure managed to get us from, sometimes when you need to make a step, so it's hard to go from 0 to 100 in one step. You need to get to a situation when you narrow this gap. And Netanyahu managed to take Israel and the Arab world from 0 to, let's say, 70. So when the decision on the Abraham Accords came, the Arab countries didn't have to do the 0 to 100, they needed to do 70 to 100. And on this work Netanyahu did for a decade, he deserves a lot of credit, even though when time came to decide on the Abraham Accords, it wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do. And the third leader is someone who I think deserves a lot of credit and asked for no credit at all. And this is the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates. And for Mohammed bin Zayed, normalization with Israel was a strategic decision several years ago. And for him, it was a matter of when, not a matter of if, of when and how, and not a matter of if. And he wanted to normalize relations with Israel, not only because of Iran and technology and economy and trade, all of those too, of course, but it was something more deep and more profound. Mohammed bin Zayed was on a process of reforming his country and creating a new, it might sound a bit exaggerated, but really building a new Emirati identity. And normalization with Israel, with a country like Israel, for him, he saw it as part of this process of rebuilding the country, rebuilding the ethos of the United Arab Emirates. So for him, normalization with Israel was almost a domestic issue, not only a foreign policy issue. And in June 2020, when he saw that Netanyahu is pushing the annexation, he realized that this is a threat not only to the two-state solution with the Palestinians that he cared about, and not only to regional stability that he cared about, and not only to the fate of Jordan that he cared about, but it was also a threat to his own domestic agenda, to his own strategy. So he decided to be the most vocal opponent of annexation. And he said, well, maybe the solution here is not a stick, maybe it's a carrot. And maybe it's not a carrot, maybe it's a ladder that is needed. And then he provided the White House, the Trump White House, with the ladder to take Netanyahu down from the annexation tree. And he said, you know what, if Netanyahu drops the annexation initiative, I'm ready to sign a peace deal with Israel. And for the White House, who really did not want this annexation thing that was just a huge headache at the time when they were dealing with COVID, an election campaign, the demonstrations in Washington, it was really the last thing on their mind. And this was a great solution of how, in their mind, on how to turn this potential crisis with Israel that could turn into an international crisis. So how to take it from this situation and turn it into a big opportunity and a diplomatic breakthrough. And again, so this is why Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, deserves so much credit for, again, giving them this ladder and this opportunity. This was a very, very, very short presentation of some of the bottom lines of my book, and I would love to answer any questions that you have.
Well, thank you very much, Barak. That was an amazing way to summarize many pages and much more in depth. I managed to figure out, I will admit, largely with Google Translate, I found the first chapter of your book online, and it's very detailed, and a lot of the players, it's really well written, and obviously, as I said before too, it's been well received, and it's been causing a lot of discussion. And one of the things you just highlighted here, and that is highlighted in the book, are these tangible deliverables that Trump gave the UAE and the other Arab countries. Now, you praise that. There are obviously people who criticize that. So I'm wondering, this is a two-part question. Well, I'll just ask that one, and then I'll ask one that's related to that. What do you say to those critics?
Look, I dealt with this criticism in the book. There were several kinds of criticism for the Abraham Accords. First, there were those who said, why are you calling this peace agreements? There was no war between Israel and the UAE. No Israeli killed an Emirati and no Emirati killed an Israeli. So why are you calling it a peace agreement? It's just a political spin. It's not peace. It's a normalization agreement, whatever. And this criticism, I think, was mostly heard from, and again, it was very unfortunate that the people, the main camp in Israel who expressed this criticism was the center left, who is, let's say, over the years was the political camp that pushed for peace with the Arab world. And then obviously I think it was also motivated by the fact that the person who was involved in the Abraham Accords was Benjamin Netanyahu, and the other one was Donald Trump, two people that are not very popular in the Israeli center left, to say the least. But in any case, and what I wrote about this criticism is that a peace agreement is an agreement that ends a war. That's true, but it's not only that. Meaning, a peace agreement is called a peace agreement because it serves as a compass of how do you want this relationship to look like. And when you read the Israel-UAE peace treaty, you see that it deals a lot with how do we want to see this relationship going forward. Okay, not only that there's not going to be war, that's obvious, but what does it mean that we have a relationship? Okay, and when you look at it, a lot of it is explaining and detailing what it means to have peace with somebody. And by the way, one anecdote that I found while writing the book is that it's really not a new, nobody invented the wheel here, that, you know, signing a peace agreement between two countries that never fought each other. There are at least 5 or 6 examples from, you know, the last century. Like, did you know, for example, that Argentina and Japan signed the peace treaty in 1951? I can assure you that no Argentinian killed any Japanese, and vice versa. So that's one kind of criticism. Another kind of criticism is that people said, oh, it's not a peace treaty, it's an arms deal. And because they were referring to the F-35 deal with the UAE. And again, while it was it wasn't, at least from all the research I did, and I spoke to all the people involved, while the F-35 issue was dealt very poorly by Netanyahu, who hid it from his cabinet, from the security services, from the IDF. I know it might sound crazy to you, but it actually happened. He did not tell the IDF, the Israeli military, that this issue is on the table. So while all of that happened, it wasn't a quid pro quo, meaning it wasn't that if the UAE did not get the F-35, they wouldn't sign the deal. They wouldn't, you know, normalize relations with Israel. It was a sort of a, let's call it, I don't know, an appendix to, you know, like an annex to the deal. And it was between the UAE and the US, when the Emirati argument was, you didn't want to sell us F-35s for years because you said that, you know, you need to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge in the region. But if we're making peace with Israel and we're friends with Israel now, why would you have a problem? And the Israeli government, at the end of the day, announced that it has no problem with the UAE getting the F-35s. By the way, the UAE will get the F-35s in, like, I don't know, 7 years' time, when I'm sure that,
well, or
then,
even you were just commented in one of your news items that, in fact, the deal might be in jeopardy.
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with Israel. It has
of course,
to do with, like, China and you know, all sorts of issues. So it's not like the deal is happening tomorrow anyway. And there was a third kind of criticism. They said it wasn't a peace deal. It was a business deal between tycoons, because there was this, you know, an oil deal that was signed that since then was already sort of canceled, and there were and people said, oh, you know, only rich people will benefit. So while the last 18 months saw a huge rise in trade, huge increase in trade between Israel and the UAE, and made a lot of businessmen very successful, it also benefited you know, average Israelis. And just to give you one example, 300,000 Israelis visited the UAE since the Abraham Accords were signed. That's a huge number in 18 months. And during COVID, 300,000 Israelis. This means that literally every 10th family in the country was actually, you know, touched by those agreements, not just, you know, watched it on TV, but actually experienced it in real life. So I think it will just continue more and more and more. Trade between Israel and the UAE is now at 1.5 billion. Okay, a year and a half ago, trade was something like 200 million. So it's a huge increase, and it will just continue. And for the Israeli economy, this is a market. This is just a huge market with great opportunities. And again, that's just the beginning. You have Bahrain, you have Morocco, and from there also other countries that still don't have relations with Israel. I guess they'll find ways that to get trade through those countries. And so I'm sure that the average Israeli would also benefit from those agreements.
Well, in the Guardian review of your book in December, they talked about some of the economic, like the UAE announcing a $10 billion investment fund in key Israeli economic sectors and envisions $1 trillion in investment funding into Israel. So there is that advantage. And as that, just looking at the future and what it could come of it, I mean, it took a Trump and a Netanyahu to get it done, perhaps, but it's going to be a Biden and Bennett that keep it going in the meantime. So what do you sort of envision of those, the role of the US, I guess, in going forward in particular?
Look, it was kind of funny that when the Biden supported the Abraham Accords, when he was still candidate Biden, he issued a very, very, very positive statement about the Abraham Accords like an hour after it was announced. But the Biden administration in the first few months in office was kind of, cool to the whole thing. And funny enough, for several months, the spokespeople of the Biden administration refused to use the term Abraham Accords. Every time when they were asked about it, they used the term normalization agreements. And in September, when there was the first anniversary of the Abraham Accords, it was like somebody switched on the light in Washington, and they started embracing it. And since September, the U.S. government has done quite a lot to strengthen the Abraham Accords and to try and get new ones. On the Israeli side, it was sort of the same, meaning Prime Minister Bennett, when he assumed office, for the first 3 months, he didn't deal with the Abraham Accords. It was like they didn't exist. And I remember that the first anniversary, September 15th, was Yom Kippur Eve. And some of the like the foreign minister issued a statement like on like in the morning of Yom Kippur Eve, before the holiday comes. He issued a statement about the anniversary of the Abraham Accords, and Bennett didn't say anything. So I remember I tweeted that Bennett is staying away from this issue, and I remember one of his aides called me while we were preparing, for Yom Kippur, and he called me and said, why did you tweet this thing that we're cool about the Abraham Accords? Don't you think you're too emotionally attached to this issue? So I told him, don't you think you're too emotionally detached from the issue? And so it took 3 or 4 months to Bennett to realize that this thing is bigger than just, Netanyahu and his legacy, and that Israel has so much to gain, and that he personally has a lot to gain politically by embracing it. And then he started doing this. And he went to the UAE. I just came back from Bahrain last week. I was there with the Prime Minister. And the next, the big question is what's next? And when you ask what's next, it's usually people say, all right, yeah, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, that's great. But what about Saudi Arabia? And that's the, like, I don't know, the crown jewel. And actually the Biden administration spoke about this with the Saudis. And Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, went to Riyadh and he saw Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And he told him, what do you think about normalization with Israel? So he said, I think it's a great idea. So he said, oh, great, I'm glad to hear it. He said, yeah, but I have a few conditions. And he gave him a list of conditions. And surprisingly or totally unsurprisingly, all the conditions had nothing to do with Israel. They had to do with America.
Wow.
And when the Americans looked at the list, they realized that the road for that any normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel will have to go through normalization between the US and Saudi Arabia. And the first condition the Saudis put forward was that Mohammed bin Salman would be invited to the White House to meet Biden. And, as you know, Mohammed bin Salman was has turned into a pariah in Washington. By the way, not only with Democrats, also with some of the Republicans for the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Biden will have to take a very hard decision if he wants to move ahead with the Abraham Accords. And Biden has, on the one hand, it's a very big political risk. On the other hand, he can get a lot of gain out of it. And, you have to realize that if Biden gets a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, this will continue this domino effect in the region, because if Saudi comes in, then Indonesia comes in, the biggest Muslim majority country. And then Kuwait comes in, and Oman comes in, and Muslim countries in Africa join, and Pakistan, and it's literally the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will continue, obviously. But it could be, for Biden, it could be a huge foreign policy achievement, but you'll have to take very hard decisions if you want to do it.
So you mentioned the Palestinian-Israel conflict, and of course, some people say maybe the Abraham Accords is the death knell to that. On the other hand, I've heard you speak, and I assume it's in your book as well, that actually this could, well, first of all, the Abraham Accords flipped it on its head. Before it was, you had to get peace with the Palestinians and then move on. But this has flipped it. Could you just speak to that, one, about the whole change in direction, but also where you think the Palestinian peace process, Israeli peace process stands right now?
Yeah, well, look, first, that's another kind of criticism that the Abraham Accords get, because people say, oh, it was meant to bypass the Palestinian issue. And this is false, because it wasn't the idea at all. Because what happened was that Trump really wanted to get a deal between Israel and the Palestinians. Actually, much more than Netanyahu, that didn't want to get it at all. And Trump told me this. He told me that he realized at a certain point that Netanyahu was just tapping him along, and that he never wanted peace with the Palestinians. But the Palestinians decided to boycott the Trump administration in December 2017, after Trump announced that he's recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the embassy there. While I can understand the Palestinian frustration and anger, and it makes complete sense to protest, but the decision to boycott Trump until his last day in office, I think, was counterproductive to their cause and to their goals, and didn't get them anything in the end. Just caused them more problems and more losses along the way. And I think the Palestinians were very angry of the Abraham Accords, but you have to remember that the Abraham Accords, unlike the way Netanyahu tried to portray them, as he portrayed them as peace for peace. And he said, all those people in the left that for years said that it needs to be land for peace, and I proved that we can have peace for peace. That was obviously not true, because the price that Netanyahu paid for the peace with the UAE and for the Abraham Accords was that he gave up on annexing 30% of the West Bank. So in his case too, if you will, it was also land for peace. So I think that the Abraham Accords, even though the Palestinians won't admit it, saved the two-state solution, at least for now. And it's, I don't know, some people think it's gone already, but if you think this two-state solution is still alive, then the reason it is still alive is because the UAE normalized relations with Israel and stopped Netanyahu from annexing the West Bank. And the Abraham Accords, also what it did is that it gave those Arab countries the ability to influence Israeli policy much more. And I'll give you an example. Last May, during the war in Gaza, the foreign minister of the UAE spoke to his Israeli counterpart 6 times in 10 days to urge Israel to go for a ceasefire. So I'm not saying this was the reason that they went for a ceasefire after 10 days, but both the Israelis, the Americans, and the Emiratis all told me that this was one of the reasons that Israel decided to go for a ceasefire, because it was concerned that if the war goes on, then the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco will be under such pressure that they won't be able to continue with the normalization process, and they will have to back down. So I think those are the 2 biggest examples of how the Abraham Accords also contributed to the Palestinian issue, and I think it can still contribute. Just to add to that, since the Abraham Accords, and mostly after the new Israeli government was formed, the engagement between Israel and Palestine is, I think, just in the last 6 months, is more than the entire 12 years before with Netanyahu. Just in 6 months, more meetings, more getting things done, more cooperation, more coordination, and I think that the Abraham Accords also contributed to that. And I'll tell you another thing. In a weird way, the Abraham Accords also contributed to the political change in Israel that brought up this new government. And it happened in a very strange way. After the accords were announced, a young guy, a young Arab Israeli from Kafr Qasem called Hamada Odeh, went with 2 friends to Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv. And they wore the traditional Emirati clothes and told people they were tourists from Dubai. And all the Jewish Israelis stood in line to take selfies with the tourists from Dubai, and only to discover after they took a selfie that those guys were from Kfar Qasem, just 10 minutes from there. And it was very funny. They put the videos on YouTube. It was very, very funny. But there was something very interesting there, because to me, my conclusion from there was that the Abraham Accords, in a way, softened, maybe that's the right term to use, softened the way that Jews in Israel look at Arabs in Israel. And it took away some of the suspicion and some of the, I don't know, maybe animosity. Okay, it took it down a notch. and it created a change in the among Jews in Israel. And more interestingly, it did the same in the Arab society in Israel. When the Accords were announced, there was a vote in the Knesset, and the Joint Arab List had to decide how it's going to vote. And one of its leaders, Mansour Abbas, told his friends, look, we can't vote against it because it has the word peace in the title. We can't vote against peace. Let's just, I don't know, go to the bathroom when they're voting and just disappear. I don't know, go to eat something and just be out of the room. And they said, no, we need to vote against it because Bibi did it and we need to be against Bibi. And then they voted, all of them, 15 members of Knesset voted against it. And in the days afterwards, there were public opinion polls in the Arab society in Israel that showed that 65 to 70% of Arab Israelis supported the Abraham Accords. And Mansour Abbas told me that when he saw those polls, he said this was the point that he decided that he's splitting from the Arab Joint List, and that he's forming his own party and running independently. And today he's a member of the coalition. For the first time in history that an Arab party is part of the coalition in Israel. So in a strange way, the Abraham Accords enabled this change in Israel where Jews in Israel feel more comfortable towards Arabs, and Arabs feel more comfortable joining the coalition. And therefore, Netanyahu's biggest foreign policy achievement created the political conditions
to get him out of office. Speaking of the trust issue, because that, of course, is one of the things you attribute to Trump being able to, through his policies, and of course, one of which was dropping out of the Iran deal, the talk with the nuclear. And that, of course, is in the news these days. And Israel has sent an envoy for the first time since the negotiations started. Could you, before we end, because I know we're running out of time, but I just think we'd be remiss if we don't ask you sort of about the current state right now.
Look, if there's one thing that changed dramatically with this government in comparison to the previous government, you all remember how in 2015, Netanyahu decided to go on a political campaign against Barack Obama. He went to Washington, organized to himself a speech in front of Congress, and really played, put his hand into domestic politics in America. And this created a huge crisis with the Obama administration, and it didn't stop the nuclear deal at all. It just turned Israel to completely irrelevant. This government took a different approach. While they, on substance, they don't, think very differently from Netanyahu. They would rather not to have, or they would rather to have a completely different deal, obviously. But they decided that they're not going to fight with Biden, and that basically they rather try to get a sort of a, quote unquote, like compensation from the Biden administration than to try and derail the deal. And right now in Israel, although they have criticism about the deal, but as a very senior Israeli official told me, he said, "We're not going to cut our wrists, because of this deal. It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We don't like it, but we're not gonna do what Bibi did, that ruined our relationship with the U.S. and didn't stop the nuclear deal." So I think that there's a good chance that there will be a nuclear deal in the next few weeks. Israel will obviously criticize it, but I think we can already see how the Israelis are totally in the day after. They're talking about the day after. They're focusing on how to counter Iran in the region. the day after an agreement how to enhance coordination and cooperation with the US, and how with the US and with countries in the region, how do we operationalize the Abraham Accords in a way that we can use it as this sort of a regional security network, let's call it like that, to counter Iran on drones that they're using to for attacks in the region, to counter Iran on ballistic missiles, to counter Iran on its support for terror organizations, to counter Iran on arms smuggling, and it can go on and on and on. And I think that right now, this is the next step, how to take the Abraham Accords and operationalize it.
Well, we will leave it on that note, even though I have a ton more questions, and I would love to know what you think of David Friedman's new book, Sledgehammer, and how.
Oh, don't get me started.
It's a whole other Zoom. But I will now turn it over to Michael Sachs, who's the Executive Director of JNF Pacific Region, to wrap it up. Michael.
Thank you, Cynthia and Barak. And actually, I'm just going to take the opportunity and I'm going to introduce everyone. Everyone already probably knows him, but if you don't, you need to. Our CEO of JNF Canada and our leader, Lance Davis. Lance, floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So I have the honor and privilege to wrap things up. So I just want to begin by saying to Barak, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. So insightful, so interesting. This is actually the first time I've had the chance to hear you speak. And, there's no question in my mind, you were one of the most thoughtful analysts on international affairs, especially the Abraham Accords that I've heard from Israel. So I really want to take a moment to say thank you. I hope when we visit Israel with groups, God willing, we'll be coming back soon, we're able to visit with you face to face and have some of these conversations in a more intimate fashion as opposed to 100 people via Zoom. So Barak, really from the bottom of our hearts, Toda Rabah.
Thank you. I was really glad to see you and to speak to you today, and I hope to see you face to face in Israel, and hopefully again in June I'll be able to provide you the English version of my book so that you'll be able to read it too.
Thanks. That's fantastic. We look forward to that. Cynthia, great job on the moderation. We thank you so much for your time and energy preparing for this. Speaking of time and energy, I want to take a moment to thank the leadership of the Pacific region. I want to particularly call out Bernice Carmelli, our fearless president, for all of your hard work and dedication. And of course, Michael Sachs and Lisa and Moran, the team that runs the JNF Pacific region. We couldn't have done this event without you, and really a big toda rabah to you as well for all the coordination and organization that goes into this. And to everybody who joined us for this call, thank you for spending the time with JNF on your Sunday morning / afternoon. And I hope you found it interesting. We'll continue to bring Israeli thought leaders to your attention because all of us who do love and care about Israel want to be well informed, want to be educated about what's going on. So we'll continue to go down this path and bring you insightful, thoughtful people. So without further ado, I'm going to wrap up this call and say thank you to everybody and have a wonderful day. And those of you who are enjoying the long weekend, enjoy and have a wonderful family day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.